This is the Infinity Legend. The Legend is a result of a collaboration between Glenn Forrester and Dave Zinkum. Now Glenn, you may already know as a tournament paintball player, professional from Avalanche back in the day, also one of the guys behind Warp Sports LA. If you've seen any of the magazine ads from the 1990s, the famous War Pig Grannies ad, that was Glenn wearing a dress along with Rocky Cagnoni, his teammate from Avalanche, doing us a little favor to help promote the pig, something for which we've always been grateful. The other fellow, Dave Zinkum. Now Dave's an engineer by trade. You might know his name from his position as the scrutineer for the NPPL. He tests equipment and products to see if they meet the league rules. But we're really here to talk about this gun. The Legend's a tournament grade marker. It's electro-pneumatic in operation, and it's basically built to shoot fast. That simple and be easy to maintain. So to start with, we're going to take a tour. Let's look at some of the features inside.
The Legend is an electro-pneumatic stacked tube marker. In the lower tube of the receiver lies a poppet valve that's actuated by an electro-pneumatically controlled ram. The ram is linked to the bolt, which is in the upper tube of the receiver. The Legend has autococker style barrel threads. These attach the stock barrel, which is a single piece made with ports down its sides and is 14 inches in length. The Legend's feed neck is rather unique. It's actually billet machined as part of the receiver, metals cut away to leave a base feed neck. An adapter clamps on to the top of that base. This design is quite durable because there are no fine feed neck threads to get stripped or banged up during a bunker dive. The Legend's bolt pulls out quickly for fast field stripping. The link pin just needs to be pulled upward and it slides right back. The bolt itself is made from acetyl resin and is of high flow design. On the back of the grip lies a power LED that indicates the status of the marker, as well as the power button for turning it off and changing modes. The button is recessed in a small divot so it can't be easily pressed on accident. Inside the grip frame lies a 9-volt battery that powers the electronics, as well as the Wicked Air Sports equalizer board that drives the marker. Velocity is adjusted with a custom products regulator, the vertical reg on the front of the marker. The reg screws into the front block, which also has an available port for a pressure gauge. Along the sides, eye covers protect the anti-chop eye system. Now let's take a look at how the Legend works.
To understand how the Legend works, we need to see it on the inside, like with this cutaway diagram. The very front of the marker is the front block. It receives gas from the vertical regulator that's been set to the paint gun's operating pressure. The gas comes up through this very large opening, which allows good flow rates, into the valve area. Now in the valve chamber up here, we've got the valve spring, this coil here, and it's holding the cup seal back against the valve. That's forming a solid seal. If we had a leak that was coming down the barrel in between shots, gas seeping out, it's probably this cup seal. Either it's been damaged or scratched, or it's got some debris that's keeping it from shutting all the way. It could be one of the front O-rings on the valve, but more likely than not, it's the cup seal. That's a very, very common cause for that sort of a leak. The cup seal is connected to the valve pin. That's the center pin right here. That's what gets struck by the ram in order to open it. And it goes through the middle of the valve. The big steel part here is the valve. That has a hole in the bottom where a screw comes up to lock it into place so it can't shift front or back through the body. And there's a hole in the top where gas will go out when we fire a paintball. In the back of the marker is the ram. Now in a blowback stacked tube design, like the Illustrator, like the Spider, like the Piranha, any of those types, we'd have a hammer here and a spring would drive the hammer forward to pop open the pop valve. But since the Legend is really a true electro-pneumatic design, what it's got instead is a pneumatic ram that comes forward. And this ram is somewhat different than a lot that we see in stacked tube electros, in that it's a one-way ram. Instead of using gas to blow it forward and gas to retract it at the end of its stroke, gas only has to come up through this passage to blow it forward. Once pressure is relieved on that gas, the mainspring along here drives it back to its reset position. One of the big things this allows for the design of the Legend is simplicity. When we pop the ram out, and you'll see that when we get through disassembly, there's a ram housing that slides right out the back, and the RAM itself. We don't have to take apart more pieces to lock things together to have front and back seals on it. There's only one moving seal in here. The front O-ring on the RAM is just a bumper. The back one is the one that has to seal, and out of this whole back end of the gun, that's the only seal that contacts moving parts, which is really good because the fewer rubbing seals we have, the fewer places there are problems for wear. It's faster to diagnose because there are fewer places to check if you ever have a problem. So that's the RAM. Up above the RAM, we can see there's the link pin. That's what ties the bolt, which is this piece up here. The link pin ties the bolt into the RAM, and when we pull up on the link pin, that's what releases it and disengages it from the RAM and lets us pull the bolt out for field stripping. And then of course, in front of the bolt, we have the paintball sitting in the breech and the feed neck where balls drop in. We can't see them in here, but the Legends anti-chop eye systems sit right about in here. And on one side is an infrared emitter that sends out infrared light. The other side is a detector, and when the paintball falls in between those two, it breaks the beam. The electronics can tell there's a paintball in the breech. Now, we've also cut away part of the bolt so you can see the gas path through the bolt. It's got an angled channel in the back where the gas can come up and then blow against the paintball, and that's what pushes it out. Some people who don't understand the full inner workings think the bolt hits forward and knocks the ball out. That's not what happens. The bolt just comes forward to close the breech, and it's actually gas coming through the bolt that pushes the paintball out the barrel. So when it comes time to fire the Legend, what happens is we've got a low pressure gas tube, and we'll see that again during disassembly, a small low pressure tube that comes out of the front block. That goes down here in the grip frame to the solenoid valve. The solenoid valve, when it's actuated, drives the low pressure gas up into the RAM. Now that expands and pushes the RAM forward. When the RAM comes forward, it's also bringing the bolt with it because the two are linked together. And when it gets all the way forward, it pushes the valve open. Now with the valve open, gas has a free path. It can now enter the valve because the cup seal is pushed back. It can enter the valve, and it's got a path straight up through the hole in the top of the valve, through the angled line in the bolt, and straight out the front of the bolt so it can push the paintball right on out of the barrel. As soon as the solenoid valve resets, the little quick exhaust valve that's on the bottom of the receiver lets the gas that's trapped inside the RAM go straight out of the marker. And the reason it goes straight out of the marker is it's being pumped out because the mainspring pushes the whole bolt and RAM assembly right back to the back of the marker. So I'm going to step out of frame. We'll look at this cycle a couple times so we can see what's going on. Here we have that starting impulse. The gas blows forward, pushes the RAM forward and the bolt, fires the paintball. As soon as the pressure is relieved, everything comes back and our new paintball drops into place. That's it. Now let's go off to the workshop and tear it down to see what it takes to maintain the Legend. Before we start, I want to talk a minute about hex wrenches. Because all the hex wrenches you needed to take the Legend apart are included with it. But I really recommend, if you're doing your own work, invest in a set of ball end hex wrenches. Now these look just like a normal hex wrench, but you can see back on the end there, if I hold them in the right spot, you can see they have a rounded end. And that lets you actually put them in at an angle. They don't have to be exactly straight onto the screw, makes them a lot easier to use in tight spaces. We are going to use a 5/64 hex wrench to open up the grip frame, and that's going to start, excuse me, we're not going to use a 5/64, we are going to use a 5/64, but I didn't grab a 5/64. There we go. There are two screws on either side of the grip, on the top and the bottom, and there are two screws on the left and the right. It's important to notice when you take these off, and it's going to matter when we put it back together, the top screws are shorter than the bottom screws. You can see that length fairly well there. I'll hold them up close to the camera. But the bottom screws are just a little bit longer, and you have to look in fairly close side by side to see the difference. That's absolutely important because the top screws lock the solenoid valve into place, and if they're too long, they're going to stick out, and the short screws in the bottom actually won't reach through the grip far enough to grab into the grip frame. But once we've popped those out, we can easily see there's the 9-volt battery
right there. Up above it is the solenoid valve, that silver piece, and then we've got the Wicked Air Sports equalizer board. That's the circuit board that drives the marker. And we'll pop the other side out. Get everything loosened out of the way. One of the other reasons we want to take off the grip, whether or not we're doing anything else during disassembly, we want that solenoid valve to float free, because the solenoid valve is held on to the body by a pair of hoses. And we're going to unplug the 9-volt battery. Easy to do. Don't tug on the wires. You want to unplug the connector. Now, next step, there are a few ways we could hit this order-wise, but next step I always like to do is taking off the macro line hose. That just gets it out of the way, it frees things up, and that's just a matter of pinching down or pushing down on its connector and pulling out. It slides right out. We can even unscrew the vertical reg at this point, the CP regulator. That'll come right off, and we'll take a quick look at that while we've got it here. All the velocity adjustment when you're at the field is going to be done through that little opening right there. Let me get this just the right angle so you can see it. There we go. There's a little screw hole right there, and turning outward increases the velocity. This is unlike a lot of paint guns where turning inward increases, turning outward increases, turning inward decreases the velocity with a Legend, so that, because of the CP reg. So it's a little different than a lot of regulators out there. Okay, from here we need to take out the grip frame screws. That's what holds the grip frame itself onto the receiver, and that's a screw in the front and the back, and we'll use a 1/8 inch hex head wrench for that. Got the front screw and the back screw loose already. Get them all the way unscrewed. That's the front screw. Get the back screw all the way out. And you see, as I got that loose, the ram housing just popped out the back. That's because it's being held in place by this grip frame screw. One of the nice things, a lot of the parts here interlock. It makes things really easy to work with. We can slide the ram assembly, the whole ram assembly out the back. That's the ram and the ram housing. We'll set that aside. And with the screw out, we need to watch all of our cables, but we can now separate the body from the grip frame. We'll see we've got a few connecting cables holding us together here. There are connectors that hold the anti-chop eye wires, and those are color coded. You'll see there's a blue set, a blue-black set, and a white-black set. There's color coded, so when we put it back together, we won't plug the wrong wire into the wrong side and hook the eye into the sensor, or vice versa, or the emitter into the sensor. And we've got another connector inside that is hooking the solenoid up to the circuit board. And each of these cases, we just grab the little connector and pull it apart. We don't want to tug on the wires, and that's important because if you tug on the wires, you can actually yank them out of the connector, which means a little repair work. It's not a bad thing. I've actually done it myself unintentionally. There we go. And last one, popped apart. And now that our wires are separate, everything slides out. And those top grip screws, as I'd said, we're locking the solenoid in place. Another interesting thing is the solenoid is just kind of free floating in the grip frame. It's pinned between those screws, but there aren't any mounts for it, and that really opens up possibilities down the road. You could drop in a different solenoid. It doesn't have to be the exact shape. It just has to be roughly the shape to fit in the grip frame. So there's kind of a fair amount of flexibility in the design. And you'll see, I mentioned earlier, we've got a quick exhaust valve in here. This is the QEV, and it's on the back. There we go. That's the QEV. When air pressure is coming into this line to the QEV seals and it sends it up to the receiver. But as soon as pressure is dropped from this line, a little seal inside flips to the other side and the QEV vents out the back. And that just helps the the ram return to its rear position faster. It reduces its air resistance. Up front, we've got the front block being held in by a single, there we go, by a single screw. You can see it just below that hose. We're going to pop that out, and that is done with our 3/32 hex wrench. We'll get that screw out, then the front block can come forward. When it does, now the only thing holding the front block in place is this little hose in the back. And just a little bit of pressure, we can pop that hose right off the QEV or off of the solenoid valve, one of the two. Pops right off, our front block comes out. We can set that aside as one assembly unless we're having a problem with either one. We leave them where they are, and here's the valve. This right here is the cup seal. That's what we want to inspect if we're having a leak that is a down the barrel leak. That's the spring and the pin. The cup seal is the white part. And we've almost got the whole thing entirely apart. As you can see, if we look right through the bottom, mainspring just fell out. If we look through, we can see through the upper portion because the bolt's gone. We can actually see through the center of the valve. You can see down to my hand. This is the mainspring that just slid out. That came with ram. And our remaining 1/8 inch screw right here in the center holds the valve in place. You can unscrew that. Now to get the valve out, because it's sitting in the middle of the receiver, we don't want to use a hard tool like a screwdriver, hard steel, that might scratch the interior of the aluminum body. I've got a Sharpie pen right here. It's the right size to fit in, and we can give a little bit of a push, and out comes the valve, and out comes the Sharpie at the other end. And there we have the valve. You see there's a seal in the front and the back. The front side of the valve has this large opening. The back side has a small opening. That's where the pin sticks through for the ram to hit it. And then we've got a smaller opening on its bottom, which is where the screw locks it into place, and a larger opening on its top, which is where the air flows through to go up to the bolt when we fire. That's it. We've totally stripped out all the parts that are in the receiver. And I say stripped out, we haven't stripped any threads on the receiver, which is another cool thing. Most of these parts slide in and then get locked in place with a screw. So we're not having to cross any threaded areas when we put parts in and out. That's just a good durability factor to the design. You're not going to have a chance of cross-threading components very often. The only thing left to take apart, and we'll just pop open really quick to take a look, but we don't need to open up because you should not need to open these on a regular basis, only if you get gunk in the way, is the anti-chop eyes. And we'll just pop an eye cover off really quick here. And that, of course, being with our smallest of our 3 hex wrenches. Loosen the screw, lift it up, lift up the cover, and we have, you can see the wire going in here. We've got our sensor, and then we've also got the ball detent, this little rubber guy right here. And if those are ever worn, if you're getting double feeding, that's what needs to be replaced. We'll just pop that back in. If you had a ball break in the breech and your anti-chop system stopped working, we'd want to pop all of these out and clean that space. To get it back together, we just want to drop that detent back into place and screw it back down with its cover. And assembly process is the reverse of what we've just done. Excuse me. The valve itself is going to go back in. You might want to, at this point, before going any further, inspect O-rings. These are there are two O-rings on the valve body itself. As we look to the front side, the larger side of the valve, this O-ring is more important. This back one doesn't really have to hold serious pressure most of the time. It's this front O-ring that if this is broken or chipped or it's leaking, that can cause a leak that comes out the barrel in between shots. So we want to check, make sure there's nothing damaged there, replace it if you need to. Which brings to mind another tool, simple O-ring pick. You can get these at tool stores, or you can even, like at a drugstore, you can pick up a dental pick. Works very well, does the same thing. I also want to check and make sure that the face of the valve is clean, it hasn't been chipped, hasn't been damaged. And unless you're doing something bizarre, it shouldn't be. It'll be in fine shape. And we'll just put the valve back in, making sure that we have the larger of the two holes up towards the top. The small end hole goes in the back. Slide it in place. Again, because there's not a threaded opening here like with some marker designs, it's really easy to do that without having to worry about cutting up our O-ring or stripping any threads or anything like that in the process. I'm going to use my pen again. You could use a toothbrush, you could use a wooden dowel, anything that's soft and isn't going to scrape against the metal and cause damage. And what I'm going to do is watch down this screw hole until I've got the valve in place. I have to lean over here a bit to do that. But I can see the small hole in the valve. Now I pushed it just a hair too far. Another great place to use the pick, all-purpose tool here. And a little pull back, and I can get that valve hole lined up just perfectly. And now that it is, we don't put in the wrong screw. Very important step here is make sure you know where all the parts go. This one is waiting for me on the wrench. That's an importance of keeping a clean workbench while you're working on something. And get that screw seated and started, and drive it in with the hex wrench. Now you can also, there's a bit of thread sealant on here. You're only going to see pressure hitting against this screw when it is when the valve is actually open during the firing cycle. So you could go back and drop a little bit of thread sealant on there, make sure that stays secure, not leaking. If you don't straight away, it's not going to be the end of the world for you. It's a nice thing because it's only exposed to pressure, like I say, at the very moment the valve's open. The sealant that stays on those threads is going to do a good job keeping it from shifting out of place. The valve itself, that goes right in, and we can feel, I just felt it pop in, that's as the pin goes through the center of the valve body. And then the front block. The front block, just this simple little piece, we can see it's hollow in there, that's where the gas comes through. Front block slides right in. Give it a little wiggle. And as you can feel it when you do this, you'll feel some resistance. That's the valve spring being compressed a little bit because it's normally got some pressure on it, and that's what holds the valve biased to a closed position, even though the gas pressure, once it's in there, actually helps hold it closed as well. And our valve screw is going to help lock that into place. Just get a wrench on that, that'll go in. This too has a little bit of thread locker on it, so if you want to put some fresh thread locker on it to do the job, absolutely perfect. That's a good time to do it. And also you might want to check the O-rings before we drop the ram back into place, the whole ram assembly. You can see there's a little bit of assembly grease still on here. The legend manual, very interesting. A lot of paint guns, they're very specific. You can only oil them, or you only want to grease them. Legend manual says use oil or grease. So really any good paint gun grease will take care of the job for you. As we pull the ram apart, and you take the mainspring off, we'll pull the ram apart, you can see there's the bumper O-ring. That's what we talked about in the How It Works section. This is the bumper O-ring that when the ram slams shut keeps it from getting damaged. And then this is the actual sealing O-ring. This is our main moving O-ring that rubs against metal. This one we need to make sure that it's well lubricated and check it. Make sure it has no damage, because damage here is going to cause problems. That's easy enough to do when it's all apart like that. Again, this is really nice that the ram comes apart this easily. There's no thread locker to undo. There are no reverse threads to deal with, nothing. It just slides in together. Makes maintenance very easy. These 3 O-rings on the housing are important because they seal obviously the gas flowing around the ram itself and through the body, so they need to be in good shape. They are less prone to wear because they're not moving. They're at rest in the gun. So once we've checked that all out, got those lightly lubed, we put the mainspring in its place on the front of the ram. So we've got our assembled ram and mainspring ready to go. And the ram slides into place, and we need to make sure that the screw hole in the back of the ram lines up with the screw hole in the body. We'll push that in, and the spring resistance is going to keep it from going all the way shut. We don't need to worry about that position until we get everything back together. And then our solenoid valve needs to get hosed back on to the QEV at the back, quick exhaust valve. And it's just a matter of pushing it together. And we're close to being reassembled now. The solenoid valve gets to drop back in. As soon as everything's close, that's where we need to deal with wiring. We need to wire the eyes back up. Again, we use our color code of the wires. We've got black and blue. It's going to go to black and blue. Plugs together. Black and white. It's going to go to black and white. Plugs together. And we can actually hold off on the solenoid valve as long as we make sure the wires are in place until we actually get everything together. I find it easier to do that. And we might need to poke some of the wires here, and the hose need to stay inside the grip frame when we're closing everything up. And sometimes they want to get pinched in between the two. So a little stuffing things into place is easily done with that O-ring pick, the great universal tool of paintball. Now there are 2 screws, our grip frame screws. We've got a different length. You notice one's long, one's short. Our long one goes in the back because it's reaching all the way up into the ram assembly. And we need to push in the ram assembly. Flip this over. And this one can be a little bit tricky. We just need to make sure it gets lined up in place right. I'm going to start it down into the receiver. I can feel it grabbing the threads. And then make sure that it stays up in place, that the ram assembly is in place while I screw it down. And you can feel you want to do this soft, because if you turn it really hard and that ram assembly is crooked, you're going to be smashing, you're going to be torquing the threads in the body, you're going to be smashing against the ram assembly. You want to go light at this point, and you'll actually feel it. If it's slightly out of alignment, it'll push itself into alignment if you go gently. But the key is gentle force, not going crazy with it. With that in, our front grip frame screw drops into place. Tighten it back down. And then once they're both screwed in, that's when we give it a little more force, tighten it. And these are steel screws going into aluminum, so you don't want to go crazy and say, oh, I'm afraid they're going to go loose, and give a gorilla arm to it, because that can end up stripping threads in the aluminum, and then you've got a botched receiver. You don't want to go there. But it's just good finger tight. You do want to be firm with it so that they don't back out. And that's our main assembly done. Our bolt snaps back into place, locking down. And we still need to get the power to our solenoid, otherwise we would be in trouble when we went to fire it up. And using the pick, we can pull out the solenoid wire. We need to find the wire on the other side. This is a black pair of wires, the wire coming up from the wasp board. And there they are. And we just pop the connector together. Done. Now the 9-volt battery gets plugged in. Put our vertical reg back in place. Hose it back up. It's just a matter of hooking the macro line in. The snappy hybrid grips go right back on, and again we've got to remember here the grip screws. The short grip screws go on the top. And that's one top of one side. Long screws go in the bottom. Short screw in the top. Long screw down in the bottom. Now this one, I find sometimes you have to stretch the grip a little bit because it's going to want to pull out of place, because it's a good tight fit onto the frame, which is good because then there's not slack in it that's going to catch dirt under the wraparound part in the front. There we go. That's tight into place. Put the barrel back on. And of course, the barrel cover. And we are ready for action with the Legend. To see how the Legend performs, we put it through Warpig Ballistic Lab's standardized testing. Over a computer-controlled recording chronograph, we shot 1 shot per second and 12 shot per second strings to see if there was a variance in velocity consistency or in shoot down during rapid fire. We also fired shot groupings with the stock barrel and with the standardized barrel to see what differences there were in grouping size. You can see the rest of that data up at warpig.com in the technical section. So that's it, the Infinity Legend. Standardized test barrel so that we can see how this barrel did compared to